Welcome to ABA On Call. Join myself, Rick Kubina. This is the maturing of our science that can be done, and Doug Kostewicz.
It is so powerful to be able to convey numbers rather than the subjective nature of words.
For thought-provoking conversation. Hey everybody, would you like to get a CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words and we will tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another captivating episode of ABA On Call. I am joined today by my trusty sidekick, Doug Kostewicz.
Hello there.
And we have a treat for you all today. And the treat is we have 2 colleagues who are at the prestigious University of Pittsburgh. And our colleagues have done research, have taught around visual impairments and blindness. And these are things that, Doug, I don't know about you, but I just, where my career has taken me and what I've done, I haven't done research in these areas. And while I know a little bit about it, I really don't know a lot about it.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to learning more because we experience clients in a variety of settings with a variety of needs. And this is an important need that sometimes we may not run into often, but it's very important when we do to know how to interact.
Absolutely. So doctors Tessa McCarthy and Rachel Robinson, welcome to our podcast.
Hi.
Hi, it's good to be here today.
Well, let's kick this off with a question that is going to generate a lot of discussion, and that is, for people that have heard about visual impairments, have heard about blindness, what are some things that, what does that mean? What are some things that they should know about what those categorizations mean?
Okay, so I'll jump in here. The first thing to keep in mind, I think, is really that total blindness is pretty rare. There are different definitions when we talk about visual impairments, and total blindness is one of those, and I think that's what most people usually think of. But that's probably the least common. Other definitions we might talk about are individuals who have functional blindness, or legal blindness, or low vision.
That makes a lot of sense. When I think about, that makes sense. So you have maybe a bell curve, and you have the extreme, or I won't say extremes, the tails. So at one end you would have total blindness, and the other ones you would have visual impairments. So with that spectrum of differences, so we have a lot of behavior analysts that work in schools. We have people that do different things at home. What would be some things that they should be aware of if they're working with someone that has visual impairments?
Okay, if they're working with someone who has visual impairments, there's really sort of 3 things that I would suggest primarily. So first of all, I would suggest the number one thing is there are vision professionals that work with individuals with visual impairments. Those tend to be teachers of students who are visually impaired, otherwise known as TVIs or TSVIs. Another professional that works with individuals who are visually impaired is an orientation and mobility specialist, or an O&M specialist. And the first piece of advice I would have is always to really collaborate with those individuals, because they know the most about how their student sees and what their student sees and how you can improve that visual acuity for different tasks. And so they're really important to collaborate with as you're working with somebody who has visual impairments.
So individuals, how should individuals outside of the field or working, how would we best refer to, how would those individuals want to be referred to when you're working with them? Are they individuals? Is it person first? Um, is there a variety? If you have across that spectrum, if you have total blindness, would you want to be referred to as someone with blindness or visual impairments? What would your advice be to individuals that are doing that?
Well, there's that's actually a really interesting conversation because, in academia we tend to use person first language, and I know a lot of people still really appreciate the person first language because they want to be identified as a person as opposed to being identified by their disability. But blindness culture, in a lot of ways, is similar to deaf culture in that some individuals really do prefer identity first language. So they're very proud to be blind, and they're proud of the unique features that that brings to society as an individual who's blind. So some individuals really do prefer to go by a blind individual. Um, and that could be a person who has low vision. It could be a
Okay.
person who's considered to be visually impaired, but they're proud of that blindness. And so some people do really prefer to put that first.
Okay, that was actually what I was going to go for, is because you said that there was a wide spectrum, but visual impairments and blindness send a different message. And but then you said that total blindness as is not as appearing as often as we would think about that issue. So they would want to be referred to often as blind, regardless if they have total blindness or not. Is that correct?
Yeah, some individuals. There are certain consumer groups, and that's something that's really common within those consumer groups. But then again, like I think about my best friend. My best friend happens to be legally blind, and she prefers person first language because
Okay.
she says that that isn't the most salient feature about her. Is the fact
Mm.
that she's legally blind. So she actually prefers individuals with visual impairments.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really a good conversation. I had this talk just recently, and it's the same thing: blindness, deafness, and even autistics. So I think in special ed, we are told, always use person first language, and that's what my default is. But when you ask people what their own preferences are, people have their own preferences. So there is a recent article out in the Lancet that talks about how do we label autistic, and there are many people who have autism who prefer to be autistic. And in fact, I read a blogger, and the blogger was talking about, it was an autistic blogger who was drawing this analogy with being gay, and was saying, never say people with gayness. People identify as being gay. People identify as being autistic. People identify as being blind. And what the takeaway that I have from that is just respect people and how they'd like to be labeled, and that's the language that we should use.
I also had that conversation yesterday with a class about autism in particular. But yeah, I mean, I have found that people really want to be asked, like, what is your preference? Do you prefer person first or identity first? And like when you have that opportunity to default to whatever they prefer. But yeah, good conversation topic.
Mm-hmm.
One follow up before we move on to the next section or next part. Having visual impairments and blindness by itself is obviously a concern, but you probably interact with a lot of children or adults who have multiple disabilities. Is that correct? And just if you wanted to share some of those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to work at a school for the blind, and I would say, well, probably 100% of the kids that were on my caseload when I worked at the school for the blind had additional disabilities, and it's really prevalent. The statistics around it are a little squishy because of the way reporting is done. It's a little hard to get an accurate count, but we think that somewhere between 50 and 75% of individuals with visual impairments also have additional disabilities.
Wow.
Wow.
Okay, well, that brings us to our first word. And our first word is chair. Wow. Out of nowhere. Chair.
Well, Doug, you're the one who makes up these secret words, so
Wow.
nice job.
Okay, so now moving on to our second section. What should behavior analysts, perhaps people who are teachers, perhaps therapists, behavior therapists working with individuals with visual impairments and blindness, what should they know going in? What are some techniques? What are some general interventions that they should know going in as ways to best support those individuals?
Okay, well, I've got sort of three little tips. So I'll sort of throw those out there and then I'll unpack those just a little bit. So the first thing sort of circles back to what I was saying earlier, which is it's really important to work with those professionals, like the TBIs and the O&M specialists who work with these students on a daily basis. Like I said, those are the individuals who understand these students' vision the best. Whenever you get a new student on your caseload, the first thing you do is something called a functional vision evaluation or a functional vision assessment. And the whole purpose of that is to understand exactly how this individual sees in a real life setting. So since those individuals, those professionals are the ones who are doing those types of assessments, they really understand vision. And so they're going to have the best advice for accommodations. Sort of the second thing I would say is always think about what's in the foreground. And the other advice I would say is always look at what's in the background. And just to take a second to unpack that a little bit. So a lot of times I know with ABA, visual prompts or visual schedules or kind of visual clues are used. And so it's always really important to think about what that looks like for a student who's visually impaired. And first you consider how that individual accesses information. Do they access information textually? Do they access information visually? If they do access information visually, is whatever you're presenting simple enough for them to see? Do you have bold lines? Is the contrast good if there's color? So considerations like that. And then the other thing is what's in the background. And I have because a lot of times we're in classrooms or clinical settings and they can be very busy. So a lot of times when we present something to our students, there's so much busyness in the background that they don't know what to look at. Just a quick story. I was working with a student who was in the ABA program, but she took a couple of visual impairment classes. And she said she was working with one of her students. And she realized that they were offering this visual schedule and the student wasn't seeing it at all because they were presenting it with a busy carpet in the background and other people. And so what she did is she just picked up a binder, like a black binder that was empty, and folded it out and slid it behind the visual schedule they were presenting. And suddenly this target that they were supposed to be looking at had this nice black background behind it to give it contrast and to block out all that busyness. And suddenly this student was able to respond to the visual schedule, whereas before they had sort of been ignoring it.
Wow, that makes that really resonates with me because we just from a design aesthetic, and we want people to be able to focus on. I think that's really just a good that should be good instruction for many people. Like we have this term called chart junk. So when we make charts, a lot of people will add all these other aesthetics and there's all these things going on. And what it does is it distracts person from focusing in. So thinking about that through the lens of visual impairments really resonates and makes sense, because the more things that are going on in the background, like I would take that for granted. Whereas that's really an important point, I think, for just generally thinking about how do we set things up, what are we presenting, what is the take home that we're trying to get.
Can I jump in here for a minute with, I think this is kind of a relevant point that I found really interesting. So I, a couple of years ago, did some professional development for teachers that were in a school for the blind. And it was mainly around challenging behavior and taking a behavior analytic approach to challenging behavior with students with visual impairments. And one of the things that we talked about in that professional development that I didn't really know existed and I found really interesting was adapted PECs for students with visual impairment and sort of how to teach and implement PECs as a communication system for students that are blind, or well, not totally blind, but have some degree of visual impairment so that they can actually see, the images and respond. And there's some really high quality research that's out there on this exact topic where they've engaged in like rigorous, research design showing that you can, just because a student has visual impairment doesn't mean they can't respond to visual stimuli.
Wow.
So just wanted to throw that out there.
That's awesome. And so one thing that I was thinking about, so this sounds like a lot of classroom situations, but you also mentioned that individuals may have an orientation mobility person. And how do you deal with some of those aspects when you're in the community? You're perhaps working on crossing streets due to the busyness, due to, just you can control a lot more in a classroom versus sort of the community. And because, not all teaching occurs in a classroom.
Yeah, that's a great point. And my background is actually as an orientation and mobility specialist. So much of my time when I was working directly with students and clients was spent out in the community. So one thing I always carried with me was I always carried something called a Wheatley picture maker. And what it is it's a hollowed out binder that has Velcro compatible material on one side, and you use it to make quick little charts and graphs and maps and things like that. It's got little stick-on pieces that come with it. But part of why I always carried it with me was to make those maps. But the other part of the reason I always carried it is because it creates a nice black background, because it has that hollowed out black Velcro material in it. So it's one of those things that's really nice. So just like in the example I talked about earlier, how the teacher was able to slide the binder behind the visual schedule, it's something you can use to sort of block out what the individual is not looking at. So that's one little tip I always kept in my pocket. The other thing that I always kept in mind too is sometimes even though someone has vision, they may need to not use their vision. So if you get to a busy street crossing and visually it's just too much to handle, there might be times that even though that person has vision, they might, for instance, cross the street using their auditory senses instead.
Wow. This is really, really interesting. And I appreciate thinking about things in a variety. You think of it as a behavior analyst, but you don't have those situational specific things. So thank you.
Yeah. Is that similar advice too you would give to people when they're in the workplace?
Absolutely. In a workplace, and that's one thing that vocational vision rehabilitation specialists go out and do is actually go into the workplace with their clients or into the home, and they, help set up their workspace or their home in a way that they can function optimally.
So if I'll admit that I'm ignorant of things that I'm such vision centric. What would be some general things that I should be aware of in terms of making the workplace accessible?
Oh, there's so much to do. And it's really exciting to think about all the options that are out there these days. And a lot of them have to do with technology. We used to go into the workplace and we would teach people things like like if they had a file cabinet, brailing the file names on the back of the individual folders. And you would do it upside down so that as you're reading, you can just read it without having to take the folder out. So it's a nice little cheat. But, these days, so much of what we focus on is technology, like using screen readers, which is software that actually reads everything that's on the screen to you so you can access a computer without having to have any vision. You can access everything that's on the screen auditorily.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'll even find myself now as I'm getting older and I have to wear glasses, and when I don't have these glasses on, I have a real hard time seeing things in front of me. And I have that magnifier on my phone, and I'm using that technology more and more. And like, I just realized it was there. And that is great that we have that kind of technology there that can be assistive.
Well, and so much of this technology is becoming mainstream.
Yes. Well, that brings us to our second secret word, which is picture. So we have, so Tessa and Rachel, a number of people in our audience do practical work, but we also have people that do research and are interested in research. I'm wondering if you could just tell us about what are some things that you've done in research? What are things that you found interesting and that you have found impactful?
I'm happy to go first, and hopefully I'm not stealing any thunder from Tessa because we're on this project together. But we actually did publish a paper together fairly recently that really came out of us working together more in this capacity about, where does behavior analysis and supports for folks who are blind or visually impaired kind of come together. And so part of this project involved implementing professional development for teachers and other school staff who work with students who are blind and visually impaired, and also usually, like Tessa was saying before, multiple disabilities. So these were mostly teachers of students with really pretty significant disabilities, and many had challenging behavior. And the professional development was really around challenging behavior and looking for research-based supports and ideas that these teachers could use in their classrooms to better support their students that engaged in challenging behavior who are also blind. And it was not, I'm not going to say it was the strongest research design that either of us have ever implemented. It was really kind of a pilot program. We had some pre-post data, but we also had some really promising data around, how this sort of PD impacted the teachers. And one of the things that I really took away from doing this study was really how much the teachers are looking for research that is on kids that are similar to their students and how hard it is to find. So that was one of the things that I really took away, because like I said, every time we met, I was like, one session we talked about developing rapport. One session we talked about functional communication training. One session we talked about positive reinforcement. And I was really looking for research that was with students with multiple disabilities and visual impairments. And man, it's hard to find. And that was one of the things that they told me over and over again. They were like, we feel like nobody knows how to do this as well as we do. And what we have learned, we've developed really in practice, through trial and error on our own. And we would love more researchers to be studying this stuff and giving us more ideas. And, that was one of the things that I really took away was, they have a very unique student population, and not that many people have conducted research with those students. So I think more of us need to think about that.
So call out to everyone listening. here's an area of fruitful research.
And
Exactly.
great need.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my story.
So I'll just jump in and say that honestly, my experiences with ABA, a lot of those have to do with not knowing those principles and needing those. Like I said, I used to work at a school for the blind, and some of my kiddos had some really challenging behaviors that made it very hard to provide any kind of intervention because I felt like I was just spending a lot of time dealing with challenging behaviors. So I didn't know about ABA until I started my doctoral work. And once I got into a couple of classes, I thought, oh my goodness, this is what I was missing. This was the key to working with those students. But with my research, I did have the opportunity when I did my dissertation. I used a behavioral approach to teach street crossings to individuals who were totally blind. I used a graduated guidance approach, and it was really phenomenally effective. It worked so much more effectively than when we were just having students go through this procedure and at the end saying, okay, here's what you did well and here's what you didn't do well, which is what I think a lot of instructors do. But when we were giving, like after each step, we broke it, the chain down into a behavior chain. And once we broke it down, after each step, we were either giving a praise or prompt in that immediate moment. And the students learned so much faster. So it really drove home for me that ABA isn't just about managing challenging behaviors, but it's also about really effective instruction. And we have so little time with our students and our clients that we need to be as effective as we can.
Have you been, so as a follow-up, have you been using that now since you're teaching those individuals who teach others with visual impairments? Have you been imparting that information to them? Have you found that same success?
Oh, definitely. I teach all my students to use graduated guidance when they're teaching their students now because it's actually the only study that's an instructional intervention for that behavior. So we don't have a whole lot to go off of, but since that is one study out there that was so effective, I teach it to all my students now.
That's awesome.
One of the things I found myself doing is I have moved on in my career. I would say within definitely these last 5 years, but maybe going back, is I am loving where the world's going with technology. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's so much, like there's virtual reality, there's wearables, there are different things you can do with video. There's different things that, there's just all of this technology that's emerging. And of course now, we have this AI, which is all over the place, and we have chatbots. And I'm just wondering how either of you would see this as a line of research with visual impairments. Like what might be some futuristic things that we could think about with where we have technology and what that might lead to. Like wearables, for example. I'll give you an example of a colleague of mine that I have who is developing a watch, and the watch will give haptic feedback. So there's a technology in special ed where we call it bug in the ear, where when we work with teachers, you put the thing in their ear and you're like, hey, start prompting or whatever. But with the haptics and the wearables, I think this could just open up an incredibly new realm as one example.
Yeah, I can see a lot of benefit to that is for coaching, like you talked about, in using in the bug in the ear type of technology, using wearables instead. I think that that's a great direction to go in.
I can add one of my favorite things with technology now is sort of using phones for video modeling kind of purposes. Like I think about all the times that I look for a YouTube video to show me how to do something. And kind of like we were saying earlier, it's become so mainstream to use a lot of these technological supports. And depending on the individual and their, vision, visual perception, and auditory perception, language skills, I think having a phone, which is such a, normalized piece of technology now, and using that for either video modeling or kind of auditory cueing if the person does not have vision can be such an amazing support that is, just blends right into the general public nowadays. So that's one place that my mind goes.
Yeah, I do research myself on video modeling, and you're absolutely right. Like if we turn the clock back, we can look at when this first started. If you remember videos back in the day, they were on VHS or even before that, and that technology worked even then. And of course, now with YouTube and like I look at YouTube every single day, and some of it is for entertainment, but a lot of it too is just to help figure things out. And with it being portable, you're absolutely right that is such a rich way. And it doesn't even, even if it's not, depending on what your visual impairment is, I'm assuming it could just be audio, as you point out. So, well, Doug, we are towards the end of our time, and this has been a fabulous, very informational interview with both of you. So Tessa and Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
But before we go, we got to give them our third word.
I knew I was forgetting something.
I know. All right, so the third word is truck. So,
Tessa, Rachel, thank you for joining us today. It's been wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And for the rest of our audience, we would like to thank you. For those of you that go to your favorite podcasting platforms, it really helps when you leave us a review. And if you leave us a like, those of you who have been commenting on Apple Review, thank you very much. It really does help the algorithm, and it helps get our message out there. So thank you all for those likes and those comments. So on behalf of Doug, I thank you all for joining us today on ABA On Call.
Thanks for watching this episode of ABA On Call. To get your CEU, follow the link and instructions below the video. You can enjoy the program again there, or you can go straight to the attendance verification quiz. Just enter the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate.